Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about a very interesting phenomenon which has to do with receiving visions from God, right? So this isn't exactly tied to spiritual energy per se. In the early models of my book, which I wrote years ago, I started talking about this. Like I said, at that time I was still developing the whole curriculum. I didn't even know what the other chapters were going to be or how many they were. I was just kind of putting it together for the first time. And I felt the need to put this in this chapter, which in those days was actually chapter 10. But it was one book, and it was chapter 10 in the first book. So there was way more information that I gained since then. But I put this in that section. But now, at that time, I didn't really fully understand the nature of dreams, at least to the degree that I do now. So, this isn't exactly tied to spiritual energy. Your dreams will change when you have more spiritual energy, but that might not necessarily be related to visions, though. So, the way your dreams change in response to spiritual energy is very important, and it is very spiritual, but we're going to talk about that more in chapter 9 and 10. But because I put this here, in other words, let me just sort of make a clarification. At that time, I didn't really know about dreams too much, but I thought the visions I was getting from God at that time were from, and I think maybe even some of the dreams, I don't remember them that much, but I think even some of the dreams I was getting, I thought was because I had a lot of spiritual energy at the time. But now I realize that no, visions from God, the thing I'm calling visions, is actually something different from just having highly spiritual dreams. So highly spiritual dreams, yes, do occur when you have a lot of spiritual energy. We'll talk about those more in chapter 10. But visions are something a little different, which is not necessarily related to spiritual energy. But I'm still going to talk about it in this chapter because that's how I, sort of the framework I followed when I made the book that's out there now. So what are visions from God? Well, just to go over this first point, visions are special dreams from God that are meant to deliver a specific message. So that's really it. Visions, they're dreams. They can actually occur outside of dreams as well. I forgot to sort of indicate that here. But you can have visions in meditation. You can have visions even when you're going about your day. Like I have had them, and I've had amazing visions from God. I've had visions, well, they're usually about Jesus actually, which is a wonderful experience. Like you can't get used to the presence of Jesus, right? It's so amazing and it feels so nice, right? And I'll tell you about the most amazing vision I've ever had, which was with Jesus. I'll tell you about that at the end of the book. Like that was so, I can't say enough wonderful things about that. But there are also negative, well, not negative visions, but I'll call them warning visions, which we'll talk about that later. But just to go back, so yeah, you can have visions when you're awake, when you're walking around. Some people report them, right? I've had them in meditation. I've just had them sort of laying down, or it was one time I was kind of kneeling while praying, and I had a vision of Jesus. But a lot of times they'll occur in your dreams, so when you're going to sleep for the night. And they feel a little bit different from regular dreams. Now, when I was first having them years ago, I was having them when I'm turning away from using my psychic abilities, because back then I was studying psychic abilities in the context of everything I was learning about the subconscious, because I was trying to analyze them to sort of prove the subconscious was metaphysical. So I was performing an experiment, which I always do. I was performing many of them at the time. But when I turned away from them, and God was telling me not to do that, right, to not use them like that, I had other visions. So I started having visions, and at the time, I believed that they were occurring, really because I was started charging spiritual energy again. I believe I was charging spiritual energy again. I'm thinking of a specific vision, which, no, it's hard to say, because there's a specific vision I'm thinking of that happened right after I turned away from psychic abilities. I don't think I started charging spiritual energy yet. But suffice it to say, I sort of thought there was a connection between visions and spiritual energy, which, like I said, there's a connection between spiritual energy and dreams, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Visions are just special dreams. Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. There's special dreams that feel a certain way. They feel very similar to when you're using psychic abilities. Now, we haven't talked about psychic abilities yet, but they do feel similar to that. There's like a specific feeling, there's a unique feeling that you'll have when you're obtaining information from the outside, and it's not just coming from your mind, and it's specifically through your third eye, not necessarily through a transcendental connection, which we'll talk about what that means later when we get to psychic abilities. But yeah, they feel a little similar to that, which is consistent with this point, which I'll get to in a moment. But yeah, another thing about visions is that they're going to be very unusual. So you might ask the question, well, how can I tell the difference between a regular dream and a vision? Well, on top of them just feeling different, they just feel different when you're having them from a regular dream. There's a unique feeling to them, like I said, which feels a little similar to psychic abilities. But also, they're very unique, right? So they're just going to be very, very, very different from your normal pattern of dreaming. They're just extremely different. They're highly symbolic, which is how dreams normally are. But yeah, they're just going to feel very different. They're going to be very unique, and they're going to deliver a message, right? So they're going to deliver a very important message, and you have like an inner knowing that this message is from God, right? That's usually how I feel when I have them. You have an inner knowing that they're from God. And you'll have a lot of inner knowings during a dream. That's how dreams normally work. But like I said, that inner knowing it's gonna feel a little different during a vision. Something about the vision is gonna feel very profound, right? Much more so than a normal dream. What else did I want to say? There's one other thing. Oh yeah, when you're having visions, I mean, this is true of regular dreams, which I didn't realize at the time I first wrote this years ago. And some of that information I just left in the book, in the book I have now. But usually when a vision's over, you'll wake up right away. So you won't usually have a vision and then start dreaming other random stuff that aren't part of your vision. That's just your normal subconscious. No, you usually wake up immediately once the vision ends. And you usually can remember a lot of the vision. So sometimes you'll have a lot of trouble remembering dreams. We'll talk more about that, right? In next chapter and then in chapter 9 and 10. Because you should remember your dreams, but you have to make an effort. Making the effort to remember a dream is an expression of your faith and desire for God. We'll talk about that later. But visions are a little different. You can usually remember them, like almost all of it. Maybe not always all of it, but you can remember the majority of it immediately with no effort. It's just super clear to you, right? And that's because it was meant to give you a message. So yeah, when you come to God, like I said, this isn't exactly tied to spiritual energy, but when you start coming to God and having a relationship with God, He'll start giving you visions. I've had very interesting visions. So I've had visions of like the future. I've had visions of like future events. I've had visions of things going on in my life. I've had interesting visions. I've also had this kind, which we're going to talk about. I'm trying to think if I've had positive visions. With Jesus. I had a vision. Which I'll talk about that vision later. But yeah, you'll have visions when you come to God, and people talk about them online all the time. There are other people who have visions from God as well. A lot of people have had rapture-based visions. I haven't had that. I have had a vision from God, which I think there's going to be some disease that spreads, at least as of the time of this recording, right? There's going to be some almost zombie-like disease that spreads. That was just an interesting vision I had. And we're going to talk more about it later. Atheists, if you tell people about visions, especially atheists, they'll try to test it and say, okay, I'm testing you, and the garbage, right? Nonsense. We're going to talk more about faith in the next chapter. God will, anyways. I just can't, like I said, I can't deal with them. But for the other people who are actually interested in God, right? The goal isn't to use these to try to test people, and you know what I mean. That's junk, right? That's not the language. The language of God is faith, and we're going to talk about that later. But there's a reason why visions aren't. God will give you visions to give you certain information, but not so you can use them in an experiment and do this and say, okay, this can't. Like, no, that's just like it's. Like, I can't tell you how much in the spirit realm they kind of, how do I word it? They understand why we do that, but that is not God's language. He does not give you information so that you can put it in an experiment and help other people to know him in a way that doesn't require faith. That's completely against his nature. If God wanted that, he would just give all people knowledge right away. There'd been no reason to take it away. So when he gives you visions, some people have prophetic visions. I've had a few of those too. When he gives you those, sometimes people say, oh, they're super vague. You know, it could be confirmed any old way. There's a reason God does it that way. Again, if he wanted to give people knowledge or spiritual power to perform miracles in a way that people would then come to God without faith, then he would have just given all people knowledge thus defeating a purpose. Only an atheist would think that, you know, it makes perfect sense to create a whole reality for a single person to undo it the second you created it, thus wasting your whole time. That makes perfect sense to them. But for the rest of us, there's a reason God does that, right? So visions aren't necessarily always clear. They're symbolic. You will know. If they're personal, they're going to be way more clear, right? But if you have a prophetic vision that you give to other people, they are meant to inspire others. They're meant to give, they're like a form of testimony, right? Which helps others to come to God. There's a reason for that. God wants you to know him through faith. We'll talk more about that next chapter. But another thing I want to mention is this point. So after receiving visions, you may notice slight buzzing in your pineal gland, right? And that's because, like I said, when you're the Holy Spirit will often open your pineal or open your third eye to help you have understanding. And so a lot of times that'll happen with a vision. I remember years ago, do I want to mention? It's not super important. It was a kind of a personal vision. But years ago, no, I'll maybe talk about that later. Years ago, I just had a vision about the world where there was I just knew in the dream, in the vision, that there was so much evil around the world, right? There was a huge amount of evil. And then I saw this newspaper, which was saying something about aliens, right? Which was kind of strange. But, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in chapter 5, when we talk about negative entities. But I don't dream about aliens much, but in every interaction I've had with so-called aliens and every single vision I've had from God, they've always been painted in a negative light, right? Always negative, basically demonic. Now, I know some people may have said they had positive experiences with them or some. I've never had that. Never been painted in a positive light. They're always painted negatively, right? In my visions from God and in dreams. But yeah, you may notice a slight buzzing in your pineal gland. I've actually had a positive vision from God where that happened too, where I had this buzzing in my pineal gland. That one I think was almost like, it wasn't like a heaven experience, but it was heavenly. It was like it was a nice dream. It was something God was telling me. But this one was more personal, so it wouldn't make sense if I told you guys. And the last thing I want to mention about visions is that people have warning visions. So this is very important. So warning visions are visions God gives you to let you know you are on the wrong path. So basically, so I'll just I told you about one of them. I've had, I believe, 2 of them in my life. And I've had dreams that are different, which would be about me doing certain things, but I wouldn't necessarily call them visions. But I've had 2 ones that I would say were visions. So I told you about one, right? So years ago, I told you guys about how I just went to sleep and just immediately woke up in purgatory, right? No one had to explain it to me. No one had to tell me what was going on. I just knew right away that I was in purgatory. The worst part of suffering there was the endless waiting, and that I hadn't done good enough to sort of make it to heaven, right? I knew right away, and Yeah, there were other things that happened, but that was a vision. So that was a warning vision. That's what God will give you, if you're on the wrong path. He lets you know, right? So you don't end up in a bad place. And the thing that's so bad about that I forgot to mention in the last video, is that when I had that experience, I forgot to tell you guys, and I don't know if it was that exact same dream or vision. I think it was. It might have been another vision where one day I woke up. One day I went to sleep and I just woke up in a dream. And it's like everybody was being judged by God. And we were like terrified, right? Because, God is like the supreme judge, right? And it's like we have the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, right? In the spirit realm, God is the highest judge, right? Which we'll talk more about that later. I don't even know necessarily that God judges you per se, so much as it is the metaphysical laws he set up judge you. But we'll talk more about what I mean by that later. But in that vision, everybody was terrified of him, like him judging us. And then I believe it was that same one where I was in purgatory. But suffice it to say, that was a vision that God was giving me. But after that, I just kind of ignored it. And I was like, that was a strange dream. And just stayed on my merry path, right? Like, which is crazy, right? And it's so bad because this is what happens in society, right? We keep outsourcing our relationship with God, which I'll talk more about in the next chapter. We outsource it to kind of this almost like herd mentality. We outsource it to others. And because even though God was clearly speaking to me, and like I said, I never thought like an atheist. I didn't think that this clearly unusual dream, which had a clear and obvious message, was just random sort of chemical interactions in my brain. You know what I mean? The amount of anti-intellectualism needed to, you know what I mean? For me, I would have to do like this Dragon Balls level power up to reach that level of anti-intellectualism. But, that's how they think. But for the rest of us, that's obviously God reaching out to you. That's obviously him speaking to you, right? And I just was like, that's interesting. And you know what I mean? I went back to my life, which is not good. You should not do that. And I believe everyone has these visions when they are on the wrong path. Listen to them, right? And that's why I say when atheists say that God never spoke to them and this and that, I 100% don't believe them. They've absolutely had those visions. They've absolutely had, we'll talk more about it later, but they've actually absolutely had experiences where God has spoken to them. And they've had a reason to doubt, right? So that's what God gives you. He doesn't make it so clear that you can come to him without faith, because that's how you have to come to him, is through faith. He will give you a reason to doubt, which just can't be denied. And he knows when you know, right? He knows when you've gotten the message. So if you've had these visions in your life, if you can remember when you've had them, listen to them, right? They're not just random things in your brain, right? That's obviously nonsense. And I've had another vision, a warning vision, years later, which actually was related to all of this stuff that I'm telling you guys about. So what for years, right? I've been creating these theories for years, right? I've been doing experiments and studying and sort of using scientific method on a whole bunch of stuff related to the subconscious. And so it's a long story. I haven't really talked about that, but suffice it to say that I've been doing this for so many years. Now, I love theorizing. I do it all day. I don't get tired of theorizing. I've been that way really my whole life. But when I was doing it, even though I liked the theorizing part, there were certain aspects of it that were tough, right? And it wasn't really related to theorizing because I love that, but there were other aspects of my life that were tough. And but I always felt like, no, I need to finish this book because I felt like this is part of my purpose from God, right? And there's experiences I haven't told you guys about, but suffice it to say that I believe this to be my purpose. So I was always like, no, I have to finish this. I have to keep writing the book. Because once I like theorizing. I have absolutely no interest in writing a book or building a website. I could care less about any of that. I didn't even really want to record videos, right? So I'm not even really a social media guy. Didn't want to sort of put my sort of self out there like that. I have no interest in that. The only thing I really like is theorizing. I love making theory. But I believe God wanted me to do all of this. And so it took me years to write the book. And I was still developing the theory as I was writing, which is why there's 4 different versions of the book. But suffice it to say, it was tough. And when I was near the end, I was thinking like, you know what? I'm going to do something. There was something I wanted to do, which is a little personal, but there's something I wanted to do. Which more or less, I guess I could just say it. I wanted to kind of more focus on kind of having fun and enjoying myself a little more, because I couldn't really do that while writing a book. I had to stay in the zone, right? Now, we talked about the nature of the subconscious, where you can't use your subconscious for a million different things at once. You have to pick something, and then you charge the best when you focus on that one thing, and you have the greatest transcendental performance, which I knew that years ago, right? So I knew if I focus on all these other things, I'm not going to be able to solve these problems and figure these things out, because I won't have access to my transcendental intelligence as much, right? At that time, I was still figuring out a lot of the principles I'm telling you about now, and I didn't know about subconscious paths at all back then. And that was always what tripped me up when I got to that section of the book. But I'm kind of going on a tangent here. But suffice it to say that I wanted to start focusing on doing some other things more. I was still planning on finishing the book, but I was like, I knew it was going to slow down, because now I'm not charging my subconscious specifically for that purpose, right? So my ability to understand things is going to slow down. My inspiration, transcendental intelligence, all that stuff was going to kind of slow down, because I'm using my subconscious for other stuff now, and it's increasing my performance in other areas. And I thought about that for years, but I just never did it, because I always felt like this was my purpose, right? I'm like, no, I'm just going to endure the hardship, right? Of, the amount of work I've done, like it's like Eric Thomas says, like doing work when nobody's looking. Like I've been doing that for years, every day, just by myself. No one really even knew what I was doing that stuff. But when I was close to the end, I'm like, well, I'm close to the end now. I could afford to do it, even if it'll slow down the work. And the night that I was like sure that I was going to do that, boom, I had a vision, right? And the vision was fairly personal, right? But it was not a great vision, right? It wasn't like, you can have visions that are good. This was not a good one, right? It wasn't like super bad. Like, and that's the thing about God. He treats me with kid gloves, which I always tell him I appreciate that, because I know he could go much harder. But I had a vision where the vision was basically telling me that if I go this path that I was about to choose, it was telling me that this was where I was going to end up, which was not a nice place, right? And it wasn't like, he wasn't even really telling me to do anything. It was just telling me like, this is what's going to happen. It's up to you if you want to do it or not. It wasn't like a direct command, right? It didn't feel like that. It was literally just giving me sort of a courtesy, courtesy information about this is what will happen. In other words, it was like a courtesy to just show me this is going to be the end of the path if you choose this way, right? So I'm already telling you ahead of time. I can't be wrong, right? So basically, this is how I imagine God telling me, like, I can't be wrong. It didn't tell me what was going to be in between my choice that night and the end of the path. It just told me that this is the end if you go this way. It may not seem like it for years that you're going to go here, but this is the end result. I've already showed you the ending. If you still want to do it anyway, you can. But this is exactly where it's going to be. Right? It's like watching a movie. Right? Once you know the ending, you may not even care to watch it anymore. That's kind of what happened. Like, oh, that's where it's going to end. Then I was like, no, I don't want to do that. And so then I didn't choose to go that direction. I continued with all of this stuff. So my point is that was a warning vision. And in the vision, I woke up. It was just almost exactly like the purgatory vision, right? I just went to sleep, and I just woke up. It was like I was in the city, and I was completely lucid. I knew immediately that I was there for a kind of a bad reason. I knew that it wasn't something that was permanent or fixed. I knew that was a warning. I immediately knew that I was being warned about something. And I kind of knew what the reason was, but I didn't know what was actually going to happen in the vision. But as soon as I was there, I immediately woke up. I was perfectly lucid, and I knew that I was being warned about the decision I was going to make, and that it was bad. Right? You can just feel it. Like, so it's in your subconscious. It's just a feeling or part of compulsion. And the thing I was a little worried about in the vision is I didn't know how long I was going to be there, because time works differently there. So I was like, oh man, I knew I had done bad and that I was being warned about something, but I didn't know how long I was going to be there. I didn't know what was going to happen. So bad things were going to start trying to hurt me, which they did in the vision, or they were going to in the vision. And but then eventually I woke up and I was like, oh, I'm not doing that, right? So again, if you have those visions, listen to them, right? They are very important. That is God speaking to you. He speaks to you in many other ways too, but this is one of the loudest ways he speaks to you to get your attention, right? Especially when it's something very important to your life's path and your life's purpose. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to cover. Um, yeah, I think that's it. Oh yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention. I don't know if I mentioned it already, but I wanted to say that I believe that atheists definitely get these visions, and when they tell you that God never spoke to them, like I said, I don't believe them because I know. I believe I know how this stuff works, but I'll just say I know how this stuff works. They absolutely have gotten visions before, and they've gotten messages from God. What happens is they convince themselves nothing really happened. So what really happens is out of pride, they're rejecting God, right? Because their pride will not let them sort of speak to God because they feel embarrassed because they think they're speaking to someone that isn't there and people might make fun of them. So they would rather reject God than have a relationship with them because they don't want to feel like they're putting themselves in that position, so their pride gets in the way. So they completely ignore their visions and they pretend like they never happened. And they'll talk to other people like they never had those visions, but they've had them. Oh, please. Like I said, I haven't done the research on this particular component. I know there are some atheists who will tell you about the visions they got, like Howard Stern. Well, his was a near-death experience. But there are others. But I'm sure, if I've done the research, I can find them. But I'm sure there'll be many atheists who will just admit, oh yeah, I had a vision, right? That I turned away. I turned toward God. I turned away from atheism. But a lot of them who get them, they'll pretend, oh, I never got anything. They've had them. Oh, please. Like, I don't believe that. You just ignore them. Because this is something that happens to me too. Like, I've had so many experiences from God. Like, you'll once I tell you how dreams work, then you're going to understand, like, you get messages, dreams all the time, right? So I've had so many experiences with God, it's like I can't remember them all, and they go out of your mind after a while. But when you have warning visions, if you just pretend they didn't happen, which is what atheists do with everything supernatural, they just pretend they didn't happen, and they just say this didn't happen. What happened didn't really happen. There's always some reason or some excuse why what happened didn't actually happen, and so they do that when they have these visions too, and they eventually forget about them. And because they forget about them, they think God forgot about them. No, God knows everything he did and all the ways he tried to reach you, and he sees them all with perfect clarity. But so that's the danger if you ignore your visions. They're going to eventually be put out of your mind, and you're going to think that it's okay to have ignored them just because you forgot about them. No, they all of them count. So, like I said, if you've had them, try to remember them in sort of just recognize that was God reaching out to you, right? Do not ignore them. They're very important. But yeah, that's it. In the next video, we're going to talk about, we're almost toward the end of the chapter, so we're going to talk about what I call the spiritual trade-off effect. So that's very important, and that really is a prelude to what we're going to talk about in terms of the purpose of life in chapter 9. But that's a very important thing that I have learned in my relationship with Jesus and with the nature of spiritual energy. Right, so yeah, that's it for now though, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.